Hi, Nat Twig here. This is part 1 of The Witches of Bedfordshire, covering tales of witchcraft and the witch trials from medieval times until 1800. So this episode does include descriptions of violence towards women in the 17th and 18th centuries. Hello and welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful and a little off-kilter in the town of Biggleswade in Bedfordshire. Each episode, I'll tell you a tale of something strange and unique that has happened in this most English of market towns or its surrounding area. There's an older meaning to the word weird, which means to twist and turn. In Norse myth and in Anglo-Saxon times, this came to mean fate or destiny, all that was and is, and all that is yet to be. Whether it's tales of ghosts or flying saucer hoaxes, the big cat of Biggleswade, or the pot and poisoner, curious social history, or the Great Swan Mystery of 1935, we'll follow all the twists and turns and uncover fascinating stories that will speak to you today, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. It's a damp, late summer's night in 1860. In a dark dell just off to the side of Mag's Lane, Oakley, Bedfordshire, something stirs. Surrounded by deep green trees, their branches dripping with rain, a faint flicker of light manifests. It is misty, indistinct at first. Then the swirl of vapour coalesces into something more recognisable, something human in shape, but something very wrong. It is a shrouded figure, female possibly, but it has no head. Silently, it slinks through the shimmering rain towards the lane. Ed and Sam are almost home. They've been feasting in Eversholt, a tiny hamlet about 4 miles away from the village of Battlesden. They only have one umbrella between them, and as they're a little unsteady on their feet, it's hard for them both to stay dry. Considerate men, they try to keep their chatter quiet, sharing gossip about the feast, who danced with whom, who fell out with whom, who told the best stories and jokes that night. It had been a wonderful evening. After passing through the quiet village of Milton Bryan, they take the most direct route home to Battlesden, along Mag's Lane. Too engrossed in their recounting of the highlights of the feast, they don't remember the warnings they've heard about travelling along this particular lane at night. So they are genuinely shocked when, from the hedgerow in front of them, a gauzy white figure drifts through the rain. They stop in their tracks, astonished. Ed's hand, the one that is holding the brolly, begins to shake, and Sam moves closer under the umbrella's flimsy protection. "Do you see it?" Ed whispers. "I saw something white, glowing, moving," Sam confirms. Ed slowly tilts the umbrella so they can get a better look at whatever it is that they just saw. As the black edge of the brolly lifts, both men see standing just a few feet in front of them a shape. A woman's shape, wrapped in a death shroud and missing her head. She is also not solid. She appears to be made of smoke, but a glittering, unearthly kind of vapour or gas, which swirls like storm clouds. Ed snaps the umbrella back down, blocking their view, like an ostrich sticking his head in the sand. "What do we do?" Ed asks. "She's in front of us. We can't go forward," Sam instructs. "We'll have to go back then," Ed suggests. Both men take a single step backwards, but as they do so, a rush of raindrops and freezing air sweeps towards them. The umbrella begins to tilt backwards again, but Ed is not moving it. "Don't!" Sam implores. "I'm not!" Ed cries. And he isn't. The umbrella lifts by itself right there, less than an arm's length away from them. The headless creature floats. It may not have a head, but they know, Ed and Sam feel it in their gut, in their bowels, that she is peering at them. It is as if the world has fallen away beneath their feet. Their knees buckle, but they run. They run through her, shivering and yelling as they do so, fear spurring them on, and they run and run and run all the way back to Battlesden. The first cottage they reach in their village is that of Thomas Butlin. They hammer on his door. He opens it, and after this night he will tell anyone who'll listen that he was greeted by Ed and Sam, their hair standing on end, straight up, their eyes wide, staring, the expression of terror on their faces like carved masks. Sam and Ed's story spills out of them as they sit by old Butlin's fire. After sucking on his pipe, old Butlin simply says, "I believe you, lads. What you've seen tonight, many others have seen over the years. You have seen old Mag, who the lane is named after, and where she haunts. She was a witch, in long ago times, maybe as far back as Richard the Lionheart. No one really knows, but before good Queen Bess, for sure. How she lost her head, no one knows either, but she haunts that spot. Her lane, Mag's Lane. It is a perilous place to pass along after midnight." We have this story thanks to an article in the Luton News and Bedfordshire Chronicle on the 15th of February 1934, written by a C.J. Kilby. He says the story was told to him by the two men that it happened to when they were very old men and he was a boy, though he doesn't name them. So I called them Sam and Ed for convenience. He does, however, name old Butlin, and there was a family in the village of Battlesden called Butlin in the 19th century. I found a Thomas and Elizabeth Butlin whose children were born in Battlesden in the late 18th and early 19th century, and I've opened today's episode with this ghost story, which is still well known in the area of Hotcliffe and Milton Bryan, near Woburn and Milton Keynes, because it's always been reported to be the ghost of a witch, and a witch who gives her name to that lane, Old Mag. It's also reported that the witch was from medieval times, though it appears the actual ghost story only emerged in the late 19th century, becoming very popular in the 1900s, when I'm guessing C.J. Kilby was told it. One lovely touch that Kilby ends his story with is this, and I quote, "We boys liked to hear these stories, even though we did not believe in them. I listened to their story and asked how anyone without a head could possibly look under their umbrella. Their only reply was, 'Well, she did.'" Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and today's episode is in two parts and is all about the witches of Bedfordshire. I've scoured the records and I am going to tell you the tales of women and one man who was accused of witchcraft over the last 500 years in this county. I'll tell you one thing up front though, I have no witchcraft stories connected with Biggleswade in this episode, though I do have a story from Southill and Arlesey which are very close by. no records that I've seen accuse anyone in Biggleswade of witchcraft during the 16th and 17th centuries, when the witch trials were at their height. So if you know of any historical witches associated with Biggleswade or its surrounding villages, do let me know. There is a reason why I think Biggleswade is an unlikely candidate for a witch trial, and that is because it was always a town that people moved through. Biggleswade's population waxed and waned throughout the week and even the day, due to the coaches and travellers passing through. It's far easier to blame misfortune on a stranger flitting through a town than it is an actual resident. And Biggleswade was not short of flitting strangers, but that's just a hunch of mine. I'd love to hear any witch-related stories you have, and as always, you can get in touch with me at weirdinthewade@gmail.com. In part 1 of the episode, we'll look at the earliest records of witches in Bedfordshire, follow the progress of the witch trials right up into the 18th century, when the trials were outlawed, yet Bedfordshire found them hard to give up. And a quick word on the witch trials. We'll look at how they came about, what enabled them and sustained them, but in their simplest form, they were just as the name implies, legal trials to prove whether a person, usually a woman, was a witch. In Europe and Scotland, these trials took on a different tone to those held in England. I will be focusing on Bedfordshire only, so the English flavour of witch trial. Part 2 of this episode follows on from this and is available now as soon as you've listened to this one. In part 2, I'll look at stories of witches, including another ghost story from the 19th century right up until the modern day. The stories I cover are not an exhaustive list of witches or witch trials in Bedfordshire, but I'm giving you the most recognisable and significant tales. If you're enjoying Weird in the Wade and want more from the show, you can always check out my Patreon page for Weird in the Wade. Just search Patreon Weird in the Wade, and there's also a link in the show description. For £3.50 a month, you can support the show and help it keep going, as well as getting access to extra content and exclusive episodes every month, and live storytelling events as well, for example. You can also support the show by sharing it with friends and family, and also reviewing and rating the show if your podcast app of choice allows. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. Wicked witchcraft. Before I tell you the story of Bedfordshire's witches, we do need to address one thing. What do I mean when I talk about witches and witchcraft? Now, I could make a whole podcast series just about the history of witchcraft, but luckily I don't need to, because there is a wonderful BBC podcast called Witch, which covers the history of witchcraft so wonderfully. I recommend you listen to it. If you have any kind of interest in witchcraft, ancient or modern, there are also some wonderful books, not least those by Professor Ronald Hutton on the subject, which I have added to a rather extensive further reading and recommendations list on the show blog, weirdinthewade.blog. However, it is important for me to explain briefly my understanding of witchcraft, as that will frame how I have interpreted the stories of these Bedfordshire witches. What witch means to society at large has changed over the centuries, but one thing is for sure, since antiquity there has been a belief that certain people, particularly women, are skilled with magical practices which can either help or harm others. The King James Version of the Bible has the line, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." It's in Exodus 22:18. And it's clear that witches or purveyors of magic were seen as bad and ungodly from a long time back. But in England, in medieval times, instances of witches being punished are actually fairly infrequent. As we'll learn when we look at the first evidence of an accusation of witchcraft in Bedfordshire, the church and legal system's interest in witches changed significantly in the 16th century and led to the witch trials, or witch craze, to reach England and Scotland. Historians and society at large's understanding of these 16th and 17th century witch trials has also evolved considerably over the last couple of centuries, and that's what I want to consider briefly now. I've come across a few newspaper articles from the late 19th and early 20th century commenting on the early modern witch trials of the 16th and 17th century. And the common interpretation that was held back then is not that different to today's. It's that the trials had been a terrible miscarriage of justice, where religious bigotry and ignorance won out over common sense and science. There was a strong belief that in a new enlightened Victorian and early 20th century scientific society, this type of tragedy could not happen again. Later in the early 20th century, a slightly different interpretation came to the fore. Margaret Murray, the Egyptologist and archaeologist, turned her attention to European witchcraft. She wrote extensively about her theories that an ancient pagan religion had existed in Britain, which survived for centuries underground, evading the persecution of the Christian Church by being passed along secretly from mother to daughter, and on occasions, sons. To Murray, the witch trials of the 16th and 17th century were an example of the church persecuting mostly women who kept this ancient pagan belief system alive. There was a hinted at possibility that some of these custodians of the old religion had survived into modern times, passing on their magical practices within secret covens, books, and within families. It was a seductive and romantic theory, which as a teenager and young adult I fell head over heels for. This idea that we could somehow grasp through the mists of a slightly more recent history an ancient, pagan, nature-based, magical belief system was intoxicating. But I'm afraid it was just too good to be true, or at least completely true. From the 1970s onwards, historians began to challenge Murray's theory more and more robustly, until in the 1990s the consensus was that there was no ancient pagan belief system which had been secretly cherished by a bunch of poor wise women and men. No, Christianity had done a fantastic job in stamping it out. Instead, the witch trials were about misogyny and the persecution of poor and marginalised or difficult women and a few men by an overzealous church. Or in some cases, the trials were used as a way for neighbours to enact revenge on each other. There was a trend to dismiss the evidence about magic cited during the witch trials as just being religious nonsense, a convenient kind of fake news to cover up what was really motivating the persecution. And now in the 21st century, there is a reappraisal of the evidence and theories. One of the opinions currently being emphasised is the importance of the invention of the printing press in spreading fake news about devil-worshipping old women. It's true that the 15th century book which kicked off the craze, Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum, was initially ridiculed and laughed at by many, particularly those in religious authority. Not least because the book claimed things like witches kept nests of penises. But as more copies were published and shared, the Malleus Maleficarum became the blueprint for hunting witches in Europe, including England and Scotland. You can see the parallels between today, where a conspiracy theory that was considered to be a fringe, oddball theory maybe 20, 30 years ago is suddenly being discussed in the mainstream. Then there were the pamphlets that were used to publicise witch accusations and trials. And these pamphlets helped spread disinformation and ideas across the population even further. In our times of the internet revolution, fake news, blame culture and trial-based social media, the culture wars, and not to mention social upheaval and looming climate disaster, it is very easy to form parallels between our times and that of the witch trials. Each generation brings their own take on how to interpret history, and that includes the witch craze. However, more attention is now being paid to the accusations levelled at witches, and a deeper understanding of poor and working women's folk beliefs and magical rites is developing. Sadly, there is no new evidence that there was an ancient pagan underground religion, but there is evidence that there were women and men in villages and towns across England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland who practised magic. And practising magic was tolerated to a certain extent. Cunning folk who could find lost items, heal animals, maybe even offer you some luck in love, were seen as committing lesser crimes in the eyes of the law and the church and the people. And they were more tolerated by neighbours, as this kind of magical pursuit was seen as helpful. Causing harm to goods, animals or other people was not tolerated, and by the early 17th century it was a crime to commune with the devil or evil spirits. In Protestant England and Scotland, dabbling in quasi-Catholic rites to cast spells or curse people was also seen as a sure sign of diabolical interference. Being a cunning man or woman was skating on thin ice once the witch trials began, but in England, many more people who were accused of witchcraft were actually let off or not prosecuted than those who were found guilty and killed. Now, it was a different story in Europe and to a certain extent in Scotland. And if you wonder why I'm not mentioning Wales, that's because they don't really have a history of witch trials. Some of the most recent research is looking at the areas where a belief in the Fae folk, or the Tylwyth Teg as they were called in Wales, meant that blame was not cast on witches but on the fairy folk instead, and that seemed to save those areas from extensive witch trials and witch accusations. The story of Mother and Mary Sutton, which I will tell you in detail in a coming episode, is a case which I believe shines a light on all of these theories and aspects of the witch trials that I have highlighted. And it's one of the reasons why I want to cover that story in the next full episode. And in today's episode, we're going to see for ourselves how attitudes towards witches and magic evolved and changed, and also where maybe these beliefs still linger or lasted far longer than we'd care to admit. It's a very cold February morning, 3rd of February, and I'm sitting outside the Records building at Bedford. It's Riverside House and you can hear the river. We've got geese honking, there's lots of gulls flying around, the swans. You can hear the gulls as well as the geese. It's a great setting and I'm really, really excited because I'm going inside to have a look at records relating to witchcraft in Bedfordshire. And these records span from, the earliest is in the early to mid 16th century, 1538.
I can't believe that I'm going to have a look at a record to do with witchcraft that dates that far back.
Bedfordshire's earliest record, South Hill, 1538. And so inside the archives, I got to hold in my hands documents from the first half of the 16th century, 500-year-old parchments in a bundle, all relating to the ecclesiastic courts hearings of Bedfordshire from 1511 to 48. That is, the courts that were run by the church relating to religious matters. The material these records were written on is fragile and brittle, but the writing appeared as bold as it must have done on the day it had been written, all in Latin and in an inscrutable handwriting. Helpfully, the archivist had told me which page to consult, page 46, and there it was, in thick black Latin script, an entry from the Ecclesiastical Court of Blenheim, Bedfordshire, in the year of 1538, a paragraph about an accusation of witchcraft, the earliest I found for Bedfordshire. 1538 was a turbulent time in England. Henry VIII was between wives. It was just a couple of years since he'd beheaded Anne Boleyn, his second wife, who, interestingly, had also been accused by some of being a witch. Henry's third wife, Jane, had died after giving birth to the king's only son the year before. Meanwhile, Henry's land and wealth grab, the dissolution of the monasteries, which was all part and parcel of the English Reformation, was in full swing. Cromwell was yet to fall from favour, and in the sleepy village of South Hill, or Southall, as they say in Bedfordshire, a woman named Alice Smallwood was up in front of the church courts. Here, it all was written before me, but there was a snag. I don't read Latin, and certainly don't read medieval or early modern Latin, but I could make out the name Alicia Smallwood and the word magica. It was the right paragraph, but I couldn't translate it. But I didn't despair. I knew that one of my listeners, Dr. Francis Young, is an expert in translating medieval and early modern Latin, and that is just one of his many talents. He's an historian, folklorist, author, and well-known authority on the religious history of England and the Baltic. I am glad to say Francis is just one of many very talented listeners to Weird in the Wade. So I sent over the photos I'd taken of the paragraph to Francis for his expert opinion, and here is the translation that he sent me. He did send me the Latin as well, but I am not going to attempt to read this out in Latin. It is testified to the official that Alice Smallwood uses magic arts. On the following day, the said Alice appeared and denied the crime, since her lord had sent her so that she might purge herself for the next day, having been attested by the hand of honest women, and afterwards, on the same day, she canonically purged herself by her security, an agreement for herself in that behalf, whereupon the Lord dismissed her. Now, the Lord, we think, was probably a bishop or archdeacon. Francis has also been very helpful in shedding light on what some of that report means. So here is what we think is going on, with a little bit of background about where in the Bedfordshire archives we think Alice lived, which was the small village of South Hill, just west of Biggleswade. There was a family of Smallwoods, or Smailwoods, in Southhill in the 16th century. But as parish records were only made mandatory by Thomas Cromwell around this time, we don't have any records relating to Alice herself. But by the 1580s, we have an Edward Henry and Thomas Smallwood and others all living in South Hill, possibly Alice's sons, grandsons, or other descendants. South Hill in 1538 was in a state of turmoil. The manor of South Hill had been owned and managed by the monks of Warden Abbey for centuries. And in 1537, their extensive farms, mills and manors across Bedfordshire had been relinquished to the Crown. Southill Manor amongst them, and it wasn't until 1542 that a new tenant for the manor was found in the shape of Sir Michael Fisher. Now, the Fishers had previously leased a farm at Southill to the Abbey, so maybe the Fishers were the de facto lords of the manor in Southill when the monks' authority was deposed. So, in 1538, when Alice Smallwood is accused by someone unnamed of practising magical arts, the village is in a state of upheaval. Before 1537, Abbot Henry Emery of Walden Abbey, or one of his brothers, may have dealt with any accusations of witchcraft, but in 1538 Alice is sent to the episcopal court in Blenheim. It is said that her lord has sent her, so she is likely a woman who works the land or in the household of whoever is now in charge of the manor or grange at Southill. It could be one of the Fishers forced back to manage their grange at Southill since the monks' disbandment. Either way, her lord has sent her to clear her name. He possibly wants the fuss to be sorted out once and for all and to get Alice back doing her job. A more generous interpretation is that he knows Alice is innocent and wants to help her clear her name. When the records refer to Alice purging herself, Frances explained to me that purgation was a standard procedure in the ecclesiastical courts when you showed an accusation against you wasn't true by getting others to testify to your good character, which Alice managed to do. Hence the reference to honest women who swore on her behalf. So Alice has enough women friends who are happy to counter the claims against her, and the bishop or archdeacon believe them, and Alice is allowed to go home. It's not the most dramatic tale of witchcraft, but it is an important one, not least because it's an early written record of a woman in Bedfordshire being accused of witchcraft, as Frances explained to me.
The case of Alice Smallwood really happens right on the cusp of a major development in English history in relation to the relationship between church and state. And that's because in 1538, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell at that point acting as Henry's vicegerent in spirituals, meaning that he has complete control, really, of the English church. Cromwell decides that he's going to ask all clergy to keep registers of baptisms, marriages and burials, which is really the first time that the English state starts to intrude deeply into the lives of every subject. And similarly, in 1542, a few years later, we get the first law, an actual statute of Parliament passed against witchcraft, which means that witchcraft is something which is tried in the king's courts rather than the church courts. So this is one of the last cases, the case of Alice Smallwood, where somebody would have come before the church courts only, really, for witchcraft. And it's interesting that we've got a lot of leniency shown to Alice. And I think that that really could be one of the reasons why the Witchcraft Act of 1542 happens in the first place, because the church courts, Cromwell certainly thought the church courts were too lenient. He thought that the clergy were not sufficiently supportive of the project of the Reformation and wanted these kind of things to be in the hands of the state. So I think that this is a case that does have a broader importance. It kind of is illustrative of that major kind of social and legal change that takes place in the middle of the 16th century, towards the end of the reign of Henry VIII, where witchcraft becomes something of concern to the state as well as the church authorities.
And as we'll see as we move forward in time, this change in the law and subsequent changes in 1562 and 1604 have a dramatic effect on the trajectory of witch trials. By 1604, it is enshrined in law that the devil and his evil spirits play an important part in the worst kinds of magical practices. It is no longer good enough for the accused to simply produce some solid character witnesses, as it was in 1538. Henry VIII's Reformation entangles church and state in a way which will become deadly for those accused of witchcraft. Mother and Mary Sutton, Propaganda and Pamphlets, 1612. When we reach 1612, when a mother and daughter from Milton Ernest, a village just 5 miles north of Bedford, are accused of witchcraft, the accusations and the way they are dealt with is very different to how Alice is dealt with in 1538. Now, I'm going to take a deep dive into this story of Mother and Mary Sutton in a future episode. Now, it's a terrible and fascinating tale which has been overlooked, I think, in the general history of the witch trials. This is possibly because we do not have any written court records for the Suttons' trial. Although both mother and daughter were tried in the court at Bedford, instead, our evidence comes from a piece of propaganda. And it's this other piece of the puzzle which explains why the witch trials in England happened. As Francis explained to us, the relationship between church and state led to the clergy taking on a role of recorder of information for the state and moved some of their traditional roles, such as arbiters in religious or spiritual matters, like accusations of magic use or witchcraft, to the Crown courts. The king was now head of state and Church of England, and that's what made this possible. But the spread of the belief in witchcraft as a real and present danger was encouraged by the spread of information and disinformation about magic and witches. It was the invention of the printing press that made this possible. The pamphlet which tells the tale of Mother and Mary Sutton is biased and full of inaccuracies, but it's also a cracking yarn. It acts as an instruction manual on what to do if you uncover a witch. The pamphlet has no doubt that any witches found are going to be women, as its full title is Witches Apprehended, Examined and Executed for Notable Villainies by Them Committed Both by Land and Water, with a strange and most true trial, how to know whether a woman be a witch or not. This trial that it describes is the ducking of witches into water to see if they swim, and it cites no less than the king's own publication as a source. James VI of Scotland became the King of England in 1603, and whilst he was King of Scotland alone, he'd had his own brush with witches. He was convinced that witches had conspired to create a storm to sink the boat his wife travelled in to Scotland. He devoted his time to learning about witches and their beliefs and wrote a book called Demonology, which was reprinted when he became King of England. Now, it's fair to say that James's belief in witchcraft evolved later on, but in the first decade of his reign, witch trials were popping up all over the country, including the Bedfordshire trial of Mary and Mother Sutton. I believe that the unofficial trial, the ducking of Mary Sutton to see if she was a witch, is the first recorded of its kind in England, though you'll often read that the infamy goes to Northampton. But the pamphlet about the Suttons places their trial at least a month or two ahead of Northampton's famous witch trials. Now, in the episode where I will take a deep dive into the case of Mary and Mother Sutton, we will look at in detail about what ducking actually involved. It was a trial where women were tied about the waist and plunged into the water. They were not drowned, as I believed as a child, but instead they were moved in and out of the water. It was to see whether they would float or not. If they floated, then they were a witch. If they sank, then they were innocent and they were hauled out of the water straight away. It was a hideous form of torture, and we will find out more about it in the future episode on Mary and Mother Sutton. But these pamphlets, like the one written about Mary and Mother Sutton, were shared around the country. They were read aloud in public spaces like pubs and market squares. They had handy illustrations on them. Those who could not read would memorise the stories and share them with others. Songs and tales about these awful witches were swapped across England like a 17th century social media. The early 17th century was a scary time. terrorists attempted to blow up Parliament, and now a threat in every village and town lurked in the guise of usually poor and difficult women who were committing evil crimes helped by the devil. Strange sicknesses and unexplained deaths afflicting humans and livestock were attributed to the witches' diabolical arts. Now, if the king believes this is true, and the pamphlets being shared from London are saying it's true, it's not hard to understand why so many people did believe in witches and their deals with the devil and his minions. Just think about some of the conspiracy theories today which are believed by many. When people are scared and overwhelmed in the face of instability caused by terrorism, war, disease, anything which they can't control, we tend to cling to answers, however improbable they might seem, if they help us make sense of our situation. To your average person of the early 17th century, being told your child or spouse died because a witch did it is probably more relatable and almost more comforting than being told, we don't know why this happened. When we explore the story of Mary and Mother Sutton, we'll find out exactly what happens when a family and a village face failure, death and ruin, which cannot be easily explained. The Witchfinder General, 1640s. Now, I've just tried to explain why the average person in the 17th century might have clung to the idea of witches causing disasters and death. But it doesn't explain the motivations behind those in authority. And with the Witchfinder General, I think we'll discover that it's about power, who has it and over whom. Now, many of you listening today will have heard of the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, maybe through the film of the same name, or through an interest in the English Civil War. Matthew Hopkins was a self-appointed witch hunter. He even made up that title, Witchfinder General. No such role had ever existed. Working with John Stern and a group of well-paid women, Hopkins rampaged around East Anglia in the 1640s, seeking out witches to punish, using the chaos and uncertainty of the war to ply his gruesome and ghoulish trade. I mean, he literally was on a power trip. In counties like Essex and Suffolk, he charged towns to rid them of witches, and the towns paid up. Unlike previously, when acts of harm attributed to the witches were given equal, if not more, weight within witchcraft legal cases, Hopkins and Stern focused on looking for signs that the accused had made pacts with the devil. These signs included physical signs on the body, such as moles, where demons and familiars were said to suckle, alongside other impairments or physical differences which were attributed to the devil marking that witch out. Witnesses might say that they had heard the accused communing with demons or having a pet toad, cat or mouse which did the devil's bidding for them. These were known as familiars. Many villages and towns rounded up women who fitted these signs and descriptions and imprisoned them until the witchfinders rolled into town. Many of the accused died whilst in prison, waiting for Stern and Hopkins to turn up. The well-paid women that I mentioned who accompanied Hopkins and Stern were the ones who looked for these physical signs on the women accused. They also performed pricking tests, where the marks identified as devil's marks would be pricked by sharp pins or bodkins, used in darning, to see if they elicited pain from the accused. It was said that they would not be painful if they were indeed the marks of the devil. As many of these marks may have been cysts or growths which did not have nerve endings in them, I'm guessing many weren't painful to be pricked, and so they condemned the poor women. It seems, though, that Hopkins and Stern did not ply a productive trade in Bedfordshire. I have found 2 passing references to witches identified by Stern in Bedfordshire, and neither seem to have gone to trial or to have been written up in any detail. Now, there is mention of Tilbrook on the border between Bedfordshire and Huntingdonshire, where women were accused of cavorting with the devil outside in the night, but I do not know what became of the accused. The Dunstable Witches, 1667. Now, there are quite a few Dunstable Witches stories, not least one about Sally the Witch, which I'll cover in a separate episode in the future. You see, Sally the Witch didn't exist. And she's one of those 19th century legends that were created by a vicar, no less, to get some maintenance work done. Yes, on Weird in the Wade, we've got ghosts haunting open sewers to get them covered in Bedford, the White Lady phantoms haunting dark lanes in order to get street lighting installed, and now we have Sally the Witch. So be patient, and I promise I'm going to cover other Dunstable folklore, including Sally, in the future. Sadly, though, in 1667, Dunstable had a troubling case involving witches, which were seen to be very real indeed. Here's how the local library resources website tells the tale.
In spring 1667, 4 Dunstable women were brought before the judges, Sir Wadham Wyndham and Sir William Morton. They were accused of witchcraft, the most serious charge being that of bewitching small children to death. The first woman to be brought before the judges was Elizabeth Pratt, who was examined and found to have witches' marks upon her body. She in turn accused 3 of her neighbours, Mary Paul, an innkeeper's wife, Ursula Clark, the wife of a labourer, and Mary Hudson, a butcher's wife, of committing the crime of bewitchment, which she herself denied. She did admit, however, that the devil had appeared to her in the forms of a man, a woman, and a cat, and that he had made a contract with her, promising her that she would live as well as the best woman in Dunstable, but that she now found him a liar. Elizabeth went on to say that there were some 20 other witches in Dunstable that wore better clothes than she, but she would not reveal any of them, yet. There is no evidence of a prosecution at this time, but later in the year Elizabeth had further charges made against her. This time she was accused of causing the deaths of John and Josias, the sons of Josias Settle, a barber surgeon. According to the record, she had come to the Settles' house begging for food, and while there she had stroked John's head, saying that the brothers were her boys. 2 days later John became ill and cried out, "Murder! Murder! I am bewitched!" This resulted in the neighbours fetching Elizabeth and forcing the boy to scratch her with a pin to see if he could make her bleed. It was believed the witches could not bleed if treated in this way. True to popular belief, it was found that she could not. As a result of these accusations, Elizabeth was sent to the county jail, but before the assizes could take place, she died in prison. By coincidence, or perhaps by some other means, the 2 judges died soon after.
This case has some fascinating aspects to it, which crop up in many witch trials and are hard for us to understand in the 21st century. First of all, the accusing of others by those who are also accused of witchcraft. This plays a big part in the Pendle witch trials of 1612, and of course in the Salem witch trials in America. I saw Goody Proctor with the devil, that kind of stuff. So why did they do it? Well, I think partly because they were expected to. In the case of Elizabeth Pratt, she is accused first and is found to have witches' marks. It is only then that she starts accusing others, most certainly because she was asked to. Unlike the 16th century trials, by the 17th century the belief that witches acted together, cavorting with the devil or his minions, was firmly believed. Single women accused were expected and pressured to name others. This is where the spectre of revenge takes on a different and more sinister hue. Maybe in earlier witch trials it was the villagers themselves attempting to get rid of a burdensome or difficult neighbour, or enacting some kind of revenge if they felt wronged by the accused, which is bad enough in itself. But by the mid to late 17th century, it's about the accused taking a swipe at her accusers or those that they dislike. It seems the women Elizabeth accuses here are her social betters, the wives of shopkeepers and tradesmen. She, we find out, must beg for food. It seems these other women and Elizabeth are not prosecuted, even though Elizabeth says that the devil has appeared to her in the guise of a man, a woman and a cat. The devil has promised her riches to live as well as the best woman in Dunstable, but she now finds he is a liar. She's still out there begging for food. So much for living deliciously. So why did Elizabeth tell this story about the devil? Again, I believe it's because she'd be expected to. Other witch trials dating back to the Pendle witch trial in 1612 included evidence like this. It was widely believed that the devil made these kinds of pacts and tempted the old, sick and poor in this way to do his bidding. To play along with the accepted narrative, to say what her interrogators wanted her to say, but to only go so far, seems like a sensible thing to do if you're poor, vulnerable and in danger. And that's not to mention the psychological and physical torture that these women were under. Say what you want them to hear and give away as much as you can without signing your own death warrant. Denounce the devil, but say that he did tempt you. There's something about the way Elizabeth tells this tale that I really quite like. Even if she did implicate some of her townsfolk, she implies that she's only thrown in her lot with the devil because he didn't keep to his end of the bargain. If Elizabeth was living deliciously, better than any woman in Dunstable, she'd have no complaints with the devil. Now, some wealthy and well-connected women were accused of being witches, but their cases usually involve some kind of political or financial motivation. The vast majority of witch trials, and all the ones I've unearthed in Bedfordshire, involve the poor, and often the destitute, those who are perceived as a burden on the parish. It is not uncommon to find accusations aimed at women who have been begging at a house, which then experiences a sudden death or illness, as in Elizabeth's case. On her visit to the Settles begging, I'm confused by her statement that the boys were hers. Was it just one of those odd things that people say in passing, which took on a sinister meaning when the little boy suddenly died? Or was Elizabeth confused? Maybe she had dementia or some kind of mental health condition that would not have been understood at the time. And did little John really call out that he was bewitched? Maybe he'd heard his parents or nurses speculating because they'd forged a link between Elizabeth's visit and his illness. It's an idea that could so easily take hold, like a thorn caught in a child's mind. Either way, this is the last official Bedfordshire witch trial that I have found. However, even when witch trials were outlawed in 1735, Bedfordshire clung to the belief in witches and attempted to prosecute them all the same. The Oakley Witch, 1735. A letter to the colonies.
The Virginia Gazette, January the 20th, 1737, from Oakley, in Bedfordshire, England. Sir, the people here are so prejudiced in the belief of witches that you would think yourself in Lapland were you to hear their ridiculous stories. There was not a village in the neighbourhood but has 2 or 3. About a week ago I was present at the ceremony of ducking a witch, a particular account of which may not be perhaps disagreeable to you. An old woman of about 60 years of age had long lain under the imputation of witchcraft, who, being willing for her own sake and her children's to clear herself, consented to be ducked, and the parish officers promised her a guinea if she would sink. The place appointed for the operation was in the River Ooft by a mill, and there were, I believe, about 500 spectators. About 11 o'clock in the forenoon, the woman came and was tied up in a wet sheet. All but her face and hands and her toes were tied together, as were also her thumbs, and her hands tied to the small of her legs. They fastened the rope about her middle, and then pulled off her cap to search for pins. for their notion is, if you have but one pin about them, they won't sink. When all preliminaries were settled, she was thrown in, but unhappily for the poor creature she floated, though her head was all the while under water. Upon there was a confused cry, "A witch! A witch! Hang her! Drown her!" She was in the water about 1 minute and a half, and was then taken out half drowned. When she had recovered breath, the experiment was repeated twice more, but with the same success, for she floated each time, which was a plain demonstration of guilt to the ignorant multitude. For notwithstanding the poor creature was laid upon the grass, speechless and almost dead. They were so far from showing her any pity or compassion, such is the dire effect of popular prejudice. As for my part, I stood against the torrent, and when I had cut the strings which tied her, had her carried back to the mill, and endeavoured to convince the people of the uncertainty of the experiment, and offered to lay 5 to 1 that any woman of her age, so tied up in a loose sheet, would float, but all to no purpose, for I was very nearly mobbed. Some time after, the woman came out, and one of the company happened to mention another experiment to try a witch, which was to weigh her against the church Bible, for a witch, it seems, could not outweigh it. I immediately seconded the motion, and made use of an argument, which, though as weak as King James for their not sinking, had some weight with the people. For I told them, if she was a witch, she certainly dealt with the devil, and as the Bible was undoubtedly the word of God, it must weigh more than all the works of the devil. This seemed reasonable to several, and those that did not think so could not answer for it. At last, the question was carried, and she was weighed against the Bible, which, weighing about 12 pounds, she outweighed it. This convinced some and staggered others, but some who believed, though in thick and thin, went away fully assured that she was a witch, and endeavoured to inculcate that belief into the other. I, sir, am your very humble servant.
From other sources, we know that the woman accused was over 60 and that she held herself innocent to the extent that she asked to be put through this trial to prove to her neighbours that she was not a witch. It seems that even the village parson was in on this unofficial and illegal trial, and if our letter writer had not been passing at the time, it's hard to imagine what would have become of her. The law may have changed, being spurred on by the Enlightenment and new understandings of science and how the world worked, but your average working man or woman was still illiterate and uneducated. The findings of the scientific elite had not filtered down through society yet. Much of the scientific discoveries themselves might as well have been witchcraft to your average person in the 18th century. The Oakley witch trial is still remembered today by many in that area, though the details have, as always, been rubbed away by time, and myths and legends have built up around her. The Silsoe Witch and Wizard, 1780s. And so we find that even as late as the 1780s, an old couple in Silsoe, South Bedfordshire, were accused of bewitching a girl.
From the British Mercury, 1788. A few months since some extraordinary particulars were given in this paper relating to the daughter of Mr. Capon, a considerable farmer at Silsoe in Bedfordshire, discharging from her stomach 52 brass pins, a pincushion stuck with pins and needles, a pair of small scissors with an iron chain, etc. The strange propensity of this child to swallow the above and various other indigestible substances was, by the ignorant, attributed to the power of witchcraft, and a man named Saunders, a gardener at Silsoe, was reprobated as a wizard and was accused of having exerted his diabolical influence over Mr. Capon's daughter. About 8 years ago, Mr. Saunders and his wife were ducked at Silsoe until they were nearly drowned, upon the supposition that one was a witch and the other a wizard. About a month since the above-mentioned Saunders died, and Mr. Capon's daughter having, through the assistance of the faculty, much recovered in health, the ridiculous notion that her singular conduct was the effect of the supernatural agency of Saunders is amazingly strengthened. For though, since April, the child had been gradually recovering from a very ill state of health, the untaught multitude obstinately insist that the favourable change is but the natural consequence of the death of Saunders, who, notwithstanding the strong prejudice against him, was, by the more rational part of his neighbours, always considered as an industrious, inoffensive man.
The swallowing of pins and sharp objects is a known medical condition. It can be related to an eating disorder or a mental health condition. But in the 16th and 17th century, young women and men who swallowed pins were often believed to be possessed in some way. And this sad and peculiar case from Silsoe looks as if the young woman involved was experiencing a mental health condition which improved, not because Mr. Saunders died, but because she received medical treatment. The coincidence of Saunders' death and young Miss Capon's recovery was not considered a coincidence by some of the townsfolk. It may be hard for us to imagine that so many of the town could be divided on this subject. We hear that some in Silsoe say that Saunders was a harmless fellow, whilst others are utterly convinced that he has bewitched this child. Medical understanding has clearly advanced for some, but has not reached the whole population. Belief or fear in particular can even today spur people on to hold out against rational facts and evidence, so I'm guessing it's not that surprising after all. But this is the last tale that I'm going to tell you, which includes a widespread belief in magical harm. The last two cases of Oakley and Silsoe are very similar to earlier state-sanctioned witch trials and beliefs, even if they're not state-sanctioned this time. Things certainly change in the 19th century. That's not to say that beliefs in witchcraft and witches diminish completely. They didn't. But the stories I am going to tell you in part 2 of this episode, from the 19th right up to the 21st century, show that belief in magic and witches became much more of a fringe belief system, looked down upon by many, still feared by others though, but not for the same reasons that the people of Silsoe, Oakley, Dunstable, Milton Ernest or even South Hill believed. In Oakley, we still had a local parson believing in witchcraft in 1735, but by the 19th century, things have taken a far more rational turn within the courts and the Church of England. In part 2, we'll look at Victorian girls playing at witches with the most horrific results. Ghost stories evolving around older witchcraft tales, and the panic of the 20th century around black magic and witches' covens, right up into the present day, and the revival of a delightful witch-related ritual. You can listen to part 2 right now, wherever you're currently listening. Thank you for listening to part 1 of The Witches of Bedfordshire. In this episode, you heard Dr. Frances Young, Owen Staton, and Tess and Matt Savigear. I'd like to thank them all for their contributions. Thank you. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented, and produced by me, Nat Doig. Theme music and the tracks Waking Up and The Ladies Sutton by Tess Savigear. All other music and additional sound effects from Epidemic Sound.